Hello, my name is Frankie Romero. I am with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm Fire Use Program Manager, working out of the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. My topic today is entitled French Creek, a Resilient Forest Story and How It Happened Without Us Planning It That Way. This is a little bit of a story from my backyard. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge help and contributions from Dustin Doan and Brian Bush, both the U.S. Forest Service. Dustin and Brian were the two that first kind of brought this sequence of events to my attention, and also they contributed several of the photos you're about to see. So big shout out to them. So where is French Creek? French Creek is in central Idaho, roughly 20 miles east of the town of Riggins. It's along the main Salmon River. This area is also known as the Salmon River Breaks, or the breaks of the Salmon River, notably because of its steep, rugged terrain. It's a deep canyon, a large elevation gain from top to bottom, and particularly rugged terrain, as you can see from my friend here, this 3/4 curl bighorn sheep that was roaming around the area as I was out there taking some additional pictures yesterday. And so the ownership in the area of interest where we're going to be talking about today is mixed ownership. It's a combination of private Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service ground. So the jurisdictions aren't necessarily as important as some of the observations here. So that's where French Creek is located. And so the topic of interest is the fire effects and results of the French Creek fire from this year of August 2021. French Creek fire started August 13th of this year. It was eventually contained on August 19th at about 1,500 acres in size. It burned on the north aspect of the French Creek and Salmon River drainage. Again, extremely steep terrain. The conditions when this fire ignited were very high. They'd been a little bit lower, but they'd been trending upwards, and were certainly very conducive to fire spread at the time. It was a human-caused ignition, and so of note is that the Salmon River Road runs along the edge of the river down here, and so the initial fire start was just off the road, and so this is notable because the fire spread in this event was mostly from bottom to top. So the fire had every opportunity to burn, mostly in a head fire uphill or flanking fire as it moved laterally up and down the river. And so that's of note, just the fact that this fire from its origin had several opportunities to gather about as much intensity as it possibly could with slope in its favor. So before we tell you about what happened on this year's fire, wanted to take a look at a little bit of the fire history for this area. Fire has been a regular visitor and regular disturbance to this part of the country for centuries. But without going too in depth, we wanted to just take a quick look at what information was in our spatial database and our fire history maps. And so after just a real quick grab at what was available in there, the earliest records we have in that database was from 1955 and 1950s and 60s. And so what you see in this image is the red outline is this year's French Creek fire. And you can see it was affected in 1955 by two different fires. One was this Elkhorn Road fire over on the east side, and over on the west side, there was a portion of a much larger fire that came over from the Nez Perce National Forest, just north of the river. It did slop over south of the Salmon River and impacted this area here. Several years later, 1962, the Howard fire also impacted a pretty good portion of the area of interest. So, pretty regular recurring fires in that era. 1970s, we did not see any records, and so the next record of fire in this particular area was from 1985. So by the French Creek fire of the same name in 1985, it was an initial attack fire. However, this one started high on the slope, well above the river. It was initial attack. Responders were on scene and witnessed a burning log as it started to careen down the hill, igniting spot fires as it bounced down the hill closer towards the river. And I had heard the tale told several times of a former co-worker of mine, Richard Catfish Bates, who was on that fire and announced famously over the radio after having witnessed that hey folks, I think we might have a problem out here. And so that fire went on to a size of over 14,000 acres, and certainly for its era, it was recognized as one of the bigger fires of its day. And so here's a perimeter for that 1985 French Creek fire. And you can see that one did encompass the entirety of the area of interest of this year's French Creek fire. So certainly it affected a large portion of the same area. The next time fire visited this area was in 1994. The Corral Creek fire was another lightning start on the Payette National Forest, several miles south of French Creek. It was initial attack, trying to gain control. That effort proved to be unsuccessful, and this fire transitioned to a large fire, which went on to display, which was up to that time, unprecedented growth. It reached a size of over 100,000 acres, and 1994, the Corral Creek fire, Blackwell fire, and others in central Idaho. This fire year sort of ushered in the beginning of this mega fire area where suddenly, fires in previous decades were considered large if they got to 1,000 or into the tens of thousands of acres. And then all of a sudden, 1994, we began to see these fires approaching and sometimes exceeding hundreds of thousands of acres. And so here's an image of the fire footprint from the Corral Creek fire in 1994. Couldn't show you the whole thing without losing sight of our area of interest, but you can see here, our area of interest here in French Creek was affected by the 1994 Corral Creek fire. And the next fire that impacted the area was in 2015, the Teepee Springs fire. Very similar pattern. A lightning caused ignition in mid-August, south of the area of interest here. Initial attack was attempted and unsuccessful. So eventually this fire transitioned to a large fire. It eventually got to a size of 96,000 acres. This fire occurred during a national PL 5, preparedness level 5 conditions where resources were extremely scarce. And so initially the responders had to rely on natural barriers and were mostly engaged in protection of recreationists and structures along the river corridor, both river corridors, the Little Salmon River and the main Salmon. So this fire did burn during some extreme burning conditions. This is the fire footprint from Teepee Springs, and you can see that it did impact roughly half of our area of interest, although it didn't it didn't manage to make it all the way through to the river bottom in all portions of our area of interest. So just with a really cursory look at our existing spatial database and our fire history maps, without going super deep, we can see that we've had at least 6 fire episodes with a fire return interval of about 13 years. The variability is 6 years between fire episodes up to 23 years between fire episodes. And it is notable that this occurred with a management response intent to suppress fires in this area. So, despite our attempts to try to control fires in this area, this is the fire return interval. So just imagine, maybe what that return interval and the variability might be had management not been intent on trying to control all the other fires that have successfully been initially attacked in this area. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of perspective of this is a pretty good return interval, even though we weren't really trying to bring fire back into this area. So fast forward to this year's French Creek fire, again, August 13th through 19th, 2021. Earlier in the year, in July, this particular weather station was showing some of the hottest and driest conditions ever recorded for this particular station. They did get a little bit of a reprieve, and so you can see from this blue line here, turquoise line, conditions moderated considerably to below normal. But beginning in early August, the trend back towards hotter and drier conditions was pretty steady up until roughly the time of the start of this fire event. Conditions had got back up into the high and very high category. Typically, extreme is above the 97th percentile line here. So above the 90th percentile is typically considered very high as far as burning conditions go. So very conducive to fire spread. These are some of the photos taken by some of the initial responders. You can see from the photo to the far right, taken, as you can tell, off the beach, so near the river. And you can see through this image, this line right here is the Salmon River Road. And so the fire initiating somewhere near the road and proceeding uphill from there. And then the middle image is just a little closer image of some of the fire behavior as this fire is progressing upslope with terrain in its favor. Here's another image of the fire that gives you a little bit more perspective on some of the terrain and the steepness there. Eventually, there was over 120 personnel assigned to the fire. Their objectives throughout was to try to achieve containment as quickly and safely as possible. That was achieved on August 19th. So the image that really prompted the creation of this presentation was one that Dustin sent to me and we had a conversation about afterwards, and it was this one here. So several days after the fire was contained, roughly a week after the fire was contained, some employees were out on the national forest across the river, and looking back, took several images, this being one of them. And what struck us as notable was we have seen through the years in this area fires coming through and doing considerable damage. But this French Creek fire, even though it had every opportunity to gather energy burning from bottom to top. These photos did not evidence that that kind of damage and that kind of ecological setback. And in fact, this image looked like a pretty good illustration of a forest that's able to withstand that type of fire under pretty severe burning conditions. So really, this is the image that led us on to this little history lesson to try to learn what happened in this French Creek area that kind of set it up to be able to withstand this kind of fire in these kinds of conditions. And so, really wanted to, share that with folks and do a little thinking about how did this come to be. And so, like I said yesterday, I decided to take a little run out there and just, see again how things are looking. And you can see after some moisture since August, there's been some moisture in the area in the month of October and the early parts of November. And so some of the grasses are starting to come back, but you can definitely see that a lot of the overstory is still in place. You can see the typical patterns of where the regrowth from the fire area is kind of getting that lush green texture to it, and the fire line along this side, where the straw colored remnants of the unburned area are contrast pretty well with where the recently burned area is starting to come back with new vegetation. So wanted to share some of those images with you and illustrate that even though there was opportunity for a lot of damage to occur here in this area, the fact that it didn't is noteworthy and was worth us poking at it a little bit to find out. So the summary, or to wind this discussion up. So, first off, we wanted to just take note that the French Creek area, it appears to be exhibiting resilience even in the face of worsening burning conditions. And when we tried to, pick at it a little bit to try to understand why that is, it turns out we didn't really plan it that way. It just sort of happened. And honestly, it looks like we might have got lucky in this area. We might have got lucky in the fact that because it is so steep and so difficult to contain fires in this area, despite our best efforts, fire was a continual visitor and kind of ever present on this landscape. And so fuel accumulations were maintained at lower levels starting decades before this period of hotter, drier conditions started to come into the area in the late 90s and early 2000s. So probably a piece of good fortune there that fire was visiting on a regular basis. So, the question is, can we learn from this example, and can we replicate this in other places? Not just in central Idaho, but other landscapes where whether we intended for fire to play its natural role or not, if it showed up anyway, despite our best efforts, what are the conditions, and are we exhibiting similar types of resilience in those forested areas? And the other question is, as a society, as land managers, as recreationists, as people who appreciate natural places, can we learn to appreciate that sometimes fewer trees is a sign of a healthier, more resilient forest? And so an image like this one, it's worth having that discussion and talking amongst ourselves about whether this represents the desirable condition for areas like this that are extremely steep and present particularly challenging burning conditions. Is this really the goal that we need to strive for if we want to maintain forest cover in various quantities as the terrain shifts from steeper to a little more moderate, and we get different aspects and such. So, those are a couple of questions that we wanted to pose to folks. We hope you find this informative and would be interested in any questions and feedback, and certainly curious if other folks have found places like this in their backyards. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to any questions.